was feeling so good about my parts.
Yeah, I didn't want to let you come in.
You
looked like you were going to make a mistake.
Use what I did on that one.
And off. I think maybe the first thing I ever heard that made me want to play bluegrass fiddle was probably the way Chubby Wise played "Can't You Hear Me Calling." The way he played the blues within bluegrass music. That was the first tune that made me kind of, wow, that's really powerful. The way he played. That's really lyrical, and it's almost like more like what reminded me of the early music that my dad played of Benny Goodman and Dixieland. It sounded like the clarinet to me. Some of that is maybe the way that the instruments were recorded in the 1940s on ribbon microphones made fiddles sound more like clarinets than they would later on in recorded history.
You were exposed to the fiddle, and you were hearing the fiddle, and so you chose the fiddle because it was the sound you gravitated towards.
My favorite recordings before I started playing that my mom and dad had were Dixieland records and Irish and Scottish music, and so the Irish fiddling and the Irish bagpipes is what really attracted me to sustained notes. Mm-hmm. And when I first heard Byron Berline live with the Dillards in the early '70s, I said, "That's what I want." You know, so
it's
hearing Byron.
It's entirely possible that those bagpipes that you heard back then they're still being played. Like they haven't taken a break.
In my head, yes, they're still playing.
San Diego, yeah.
Yes, yeah, exactly.
Yeah. I kind of accidentally became a banjo player just out of jealousy. My brother was playing mandolin, and he was taking lessons every week. And my mom and my brother's 3 years older than me. He was 3 years older then, still is. And he would take this weekly mandolin lesson. My mom and I would drive him, and he would take a mandolin lesson, and we would sit in the park throwing a baseball back and forth. And after 2 or 3 years of him doing this and us just kind of hanging out in the park, I thought, maybe I should learn an instrument. I'm wasting my life, and he's furthering himself. And so I just needed an instrument. I really didn't care what instrument it was going to be. And my parents just suggested the banjo.
As long as you're going to waste your life.
Exactly. Yeah. I think my parents just thought, well, if he plays banjo, then they can play music with each other. My brother and I could jam, as opposed to, like, trombone and mandolin would have been a more awkward duet, but possibly would have had more commercial success. So the banjo wasn't something that I had this like crystallized moment. So many of my heroes, they talk about hearing a certain song or hearing Earl Scruggs on the radio, and at that moment they knew they had to play banjo, or they heard Earl Scruggs on the Beverly Hillbillies, and at that moment they knew they had to play banjo. There was never a moment that I felt like I had to play banjo. My parents were just like, hey, how about banjo? And I was like, well, maybe let's, like, what does it really sound like? And we had a Sam Bush Late as Usual cassette tape in the car, and Bela Fleck was on there. I think they played Leather Britches, right? Fiddle and banjo.
Sounds right.
Leather Britches. And they're like, that's the banjo. I'm like, cool, that'll work. We went and rented a banjo, and I started in the clawhammer style, kind of frailing banjo, and then eventually a guy at a record store, Coconut's Music Store in Chicago, asked my dad and I while we were there shopping for records if we'd heard of Bela Fleck and the Flecktones, and we're like, no. We didn't even register who Bela Fleck was, even though he was that player on that cassette tape on the Sam Bush album. And we bought this Flecktones record, and I was just way into it. I was 9 years old, and here was a guy playing this electric banjo, and the drummer was playing the Syntax drum guitar and dressed like a pirate, Future Man, and it was just like the coolest thing ever, and it just appealed to me so much, and that's what I wanted to learn how to do. But everybody said, like, if you want to play modern progressive banjo, you have to start with Scruggs style. And so I got a set of finger picks and started learning Scruggs style banjo. As far as a lick that I learned back then that I still enjoy, a lot of the licks that I learned back then I try to stay away from because they're such signature identifying licks for people. I remember learning a Bela Fleck lick out of his Homespun Tapes cassette tape. There was a 6 cassette tape instructional thing that he had, and one of his cool bluegrass licks that I think he played on a Tasty Licks album called Anchored to the Shore was this lick that was I still think that's just like a killer lick. And so I learned it then, and now I can't play it because it's like he played it already, and so you have to stay away from it. With Earl Scruggs, his vocabulary is so elemental to the banjo that you can't really play Scruggs style banjo without quoting him left and right. He just, like, his turns of phrase and ways of playing kind of common melody ideas are so elemental to the banjo that they just sound like that's how the banjo's supposed to sound. You can't really get past. You can't play bluegrass banjo without quoting those things. You can't own this instrument without going. You have to do that at some point, otherwise you get fined.
Yeah, I did.
My dad went to buy me a violin when I said I wanted to learn to play the violin. But before he left that day, he said, there's a championship target match coming up, and you seem to be doing really well with target practice. Do you want to take that to the next level, or do you want that be to the day that we go get a violin and do that? And it was like this defining moment that my parents, I could either follow in their footsteps and be a marksman, championship target shooter, which is how they met, and or
Shooting
go
at each other?
yeah, or play the fiddle. And it occurred to me, like, well, I'm a pretty good shot, and you wear the earmuffs and the elbow guards and you shoot 50 yards and you shoot 100 yards, whatever. we lived far enough out in the country that the noise wasn't an issue. At that time.
Or
Yeah, exactly. Well, same thing about a week later. But it occurred to me that that's the same thing over and over again. Whether or not you hit the target in the middle like you want to or not, it's the same motion and the same thing you're doing in music is something different every single second. So that's what appealed to me immediately. It's like, well, no, I want to create something musical, because that's different every second. So we went and bought a violin, and it was just a cheap quarter-sized violin. About 6 months later, when I was 8 years old, the guy that had been helping teach me a few old-time tunes, he was an old-time fiddler, he said, I think you could get a half size. You could go up to a half size at this point, And so my dad found a half size fiddle in a pawn shop that had a bunch of scratches and just looked terrible. And so he had been painting a sports car. He restored hard to find European sports cars. It was his other hobby. And he had painted it like a bright Ferrari yellow, the sports car he had, an Omega. And so he had leftover paint, so he painted he added some purfling to it and painted my first half-size fiddle bright yellow. So I played that for about a year until I graduated to a full size. No, it almost got me disqualified at a fiddle contest for just being too showy, right?
That's too showy for the fiddle.
Yeah, it was too much.
Contestant number 11, you've been disqualified for excessive flair.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, I think my first banjo was a harmony banjo that we rented from the Old Town School of Folk Music. It was such a casual decision to start learning banjo that they didn't want to actually buy one because they weren't sure if I was going to stick with it. And so we rented a banjo at the Old Town School of Folk Music in Chicago, and I started taking lessons there. And I think I grew out of that banjo pretty quickly, and my parents got me an Epiphone resonator banjo, something from the maybe mid-'80s or something that was used, and they jumped through hoops trying to surprise me with that banjo. They had already bought it, but they went and placed it in the music store at the Old Town School of Folk Music and convinced the guy who was running the store to play along with this. And they placed it in the store and put like a crazy price on the thing. And the next time I was there for a lesson, I went and played the thing, and the guy was like, "What do you think about that?" I'm like, "Oh, it's pretty nice, but it's so expensive. Like, it's a pretty nice banjo." And then came home the next day, and there it was at home.
That's pretty good.
The vault sessions.
Every view
and subscription we get
helps us
buy guitars
for kids.
Click here
to subscribe. Click here to watch
more vault sessions.
and visit the website here
Perfect.
to learn more about the Guitars for Kids program.
I love it.
For every $100, you can buy a kid a guitar and 10 weeks of lessons.
You're hired.
Thank you, and we'll see you next week.
Nailed it. You got it. Yeah.